In this video I'm going to talk to you about the truth of buying a bass amp. Hey guys, I'm Tyler and thank you for tuning back into the channel once again. If you're new around here, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe below. So in this video I'm going to kind of do a follow-up to a previous video I did, which was the truth about buying a bass in 2020, and I'm going to talk about buying a bass amp in this current era in which we live. I'm going to try and boil this down to two main segments. So first I'm going to kind of talk to you about the things that you don't need to worry about when you're buying a bass amp, and then I'm going to talk to you about the three main things that you do need to worry about and concern yourself with when you're choosing a bass amp for whatever level you are and at whatever price range. There are three main types of amplification that I think are worth looking at when it comes to amplifying bass in this era. The first is Class D, the second is modelling, and then the third is your typical solid state or tube amp. The first here is a Class D head, and this is the Aguilar Tonehammer 500. Typical of Class D, it's a lightweight head. You see I can pass it around from hand to hand, and it's a pretty high wattage, so a 500 watt head. The next form of amplification that's worth considering in this era is something like this. So this is a Helix Stomp. This recreates the tones of other amplifiers. It models them. So it models both the front of the amplifier, like you have here with the Aguilar. It models this front section and the EQ. And then it would model also, if it's a tube amp, the tube power amp section, or if it's a solid state amp, that power amp section. And then also the cabinets as well, to give you very much an amp tone in one box. With something like this, you need to provide the power, so you need to have a powered speaker of some sort. Typically that would be a PA speaker, or what they call an FRFR, which is a flat frequency, flat response cabinet, in order to most truly recreate the tones, the original recorded sounds and sampled elements of the model to your ears, and to do it in the way which is most uncoloured and most naturally represents the tone of that amp. Something like the Helix Stomp is going to cost you about £400 or $400 or so, and that's going to give you a ton of amplifier options. It'll give you all the classics like an Ampeg SVT, the Aguilar DB751, the Acoustic 360, and many other classic amplifier models. So there's quite good value can be found within one of these. It's also a very lightweight box and allows you to carry it around, plug it straight into any PA anywhere you are, and use it for a gig. The last form of amplifier to look at on this list is the Class A or Class B amplifier. These are typically tube or solid state amplifiers. These would be things like the Ampeg SVT, the Aguilar DB751, a lot of the bigger Mesa Boogie heads, the Mesa Boogie Big Block 750, amps like that are typically very heavy because they use big transformers to output the power. And these are the classics, and they go back throughout the history of bass in terms of the way in which it's amplified. Those amps are typically very heavy, but they also have tonal characteristics that are sometimes harder to come by with a Class D amp. A lot of people swear by these older forms of technology when it comes to reproducing their bass tone, and that makes them still a player in the modern era and something that is definitely still worth considering. Whilst there's those three different types of technology and different ways of recreating your bass tone, there are also different styles of amplifier that you can look at buying. There's the combo, which is going to have what would typically be something like this Aguilar head integrated into a speaker cabinet, so that it's an all-in-one and you just pick up and go. That style of amplifier is getting a lot more popular and very much more practical with the advent of Class D amplifiers. So things like Fender's Bassman series now use the old Gensben style of cabinet and lightweight design, as well as Class D heads to enable them to be very powerful but also very lightweight and manoeuvrable. Often these combos will also have a speaker out which enables you to extend the number of cabinets that you're using with that one combo, which I'll talk about in a little bit. The other type of setup is, as you can see here, with this head. This head is providing the power. This is going to be providing all the power and the amplification element of the sound, and then you put that into a speaker, so like this Aguilar that I have down here, and that combination of a separate head to a speaker remains the same whether you're using a Class D head like this or a tube amp or a bigger solid state amp. The last way is to have something like this Helix Stomp driving a powered speaker, so that is where you have a power amplifier and a speaker in one box, and this would typically be most often seen in the form of a PA, so a PA speaker, so you have this run into that. So those are the three different types of technology that are primarily used in this era. Now I'm going to just talk about the three different things that you don't really need to worry about when you're considering buying a bass rig, And then the 3 things that I think are very important to worry about when buying a bass rig. If you're liking this content, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. The first thing I think people worry about too much when choosing a bass amp is wattage. I think as a rule of thumb, so long as you're between 100 and 200 watts with a good quality speaker, you're going to be fine, particularly if you've got an XLR out or some way of sending that sound to a PA to get support. Most of the venues I play and have played in my career have always had a PA of some kind and some form of foldback, so long as they're of a decent size. And that means so long as you can get your sound out to that, it's fine. So you don't really need to have thousands of watts on stage. It's really just for you and just for monitoring yourself. So make sure that you have a good speaker and you can hear yourself well enough. Don't expect a cheap combo to be able to do it. But if you're in the reasonable ballpark, something like the Fender Bassman range, that's kind of between $400, $500, you're going to be able to be absolutely fine with 100 or 200 watts. You can run a lower wattage head with a higher power handling cab, and that'll be absolutely fine. It just means that you're more unlikely to damage the speakers, but at the same time you can also run a higher wattage head with a lower power handling cab, so long as you're sensible. The most important thing is not to go crazy with the EQ. If you're just turning up tons of sub bass and running it through the speakers with the volume on max, then you're likely to blow that cabinet. But if you have a higher wattage head and a slightly lower wattage power handling cab, you're going to be okay so long as you listen to it and make sure that you're not pushing it too hard. Just be sensible, be careful, be delicate. And don't be playing, super dynamic styles that are going to make the speakers jump around a lot when you've got the volume on max, because that, the speaker is moving in and out like this, and if you're having big spikes in what you're doing, that speaker is jumping in and out, and that's eventually where it's going to become damaged. The last thing I want to say about wattage is that there are very few instances where you're going to need to turn the amp all the way up. So I actually think you're better off having a moderate to high power amplifier with a decent amount of headroom so that you're not running it on max all the time. If you're running your amp on max all the time, then it's just not right. You need to have a higher wattage head. But being able to run that amp with, there are very few places you can run that amp full open ever. I've never come across a venue where I could actually genuinely turn it all the way up and not have some kind of complaint from the PA or bandmates. So I think just be reasonable with it and don't expect to run it all the way open all the time. The second thing I think people shouldn't worry about too much is speaker size. Speaker size itself, the diameter of the speaker, doesn't really matter and doesn't really dictate anything in terms of what you can expect from a speaker. There shouldn't really be an expectation. The only expectation should be that of the manufacturer and the way in which they've coloured those speakers. So yes, maybe a 15 might be a bit warmer and less defined, but you don't necessarily know that, and using a speaker inch size as the definite be-all and end-all determiner of how you expect that to sound is not really correct, and you don't really need to do that. I've played 10s that I've really liked, and I've played 10s that I really don't like. I've played 12s that I love and 12s that I don't, and I've played 15s that I thought were terrible and then 15s that were great, all in different types of cabs and different types of environments. So don't really determine your sound and what you expect just based on the speaker size. Speaker size doesn't scientifically mean anything. It can. People do kind of try and make a speaker for a certain colour, and maybe that's why people think that of them, but speaker sizes on its own don't mean anything. So whether you're going for an 8 or a 15 or an 18 speaker, which are much rarer nowadays, but no matter what you're going for, just don't worry about the speaker size, just listen to it and see if it does what you want it to do. The other thing I think people shouldn't worry about too much is having huge single box cabinets. I think nowadays there are so few occasions where something like an Ampeg SVT 810 cab is actually really useful. And I think really technology has caught up to the point where actually sometimes going for fewer speakers in one box is actually a better option. There are very few places that you're going to be able to get that rig into safely that really justify it being there. Yes, it's great to play in front of an 810. I love playing in front of an 810. It sounds great. And when you're stood right in front of it, it's lovely. But then oftentimes, as soon as you move away from that 810, move slightly to the right, side to the left, all that 810 is doing is really beaming that sound straight down the middle, straight in front of those speakers. And all the definition you have when you're stood in front of it is completely lost as soon as you step to the right or the left. I think the better option is to go with something that stacks vertically and to have single speakers in one tall array rather than having big 8x10 boxes, 6x10s, huge cabinets that just don't really justify the cost or the effort in getting them to where they need to be on stage with you. I know that's going to be very controversial, and I do enjoy playing with those cabs, but I think in terms of actually practically going and buying a bass amp, I would avoid buying an 810 or a 610 broadly. Let me know what you think of those 3 things that I think people should not worry about too much in the comments below. Let me know if you agree or disagree. Now I'm going to move on to the 3 things that I think people need to take much more seriously when they're buying a bass amp. The quality of the speaker is really going to dictate what kind of sound you can get out of your amplifier. You can have an incredibly expensive amplifier, but if it's going through a $50 speaker, it's never going to sound amazing. The speakers are really the most important point. They are what's going to be reproducing that sound. They're what's going to be delivering that final sound to your ears. And no matter what the head is sending the signal to that speaker, if that speaker can't reproduce that signal well, then you're just never going to be able to get a great tone. So for me, I think people need to spend much more time worrying about the quality of the speaker than the wattage of the head or the type of head. Broadly, I think so long as the speaker is capable of reproducing a great sound, whatever you put through it beforehand is going to be okay, no matter whether you've got a really high quality head or a cheap quality head from a pawn shop. I would much rather, in an extreme case, run a $50 head through a £1,000 cab than run a £1,000 head through a $50 cab. The second thing I think is really important, particularly nowadays if you're a gigging musician, regularly gigging, is modularity. These Aguilar cabs here, I have 2 of them, and they're just 2 12-inch cabs, and I don't think I've ever needed more output than these 2 cabs can reproduce. At the same time, they're also super lightweight cabs. These are the SL range, the SL112 range, and I can pick these up one-handed, no problem, and I can even pick 2 of them up at the same time, and I can just walk to wherever I need to get to with this rig. And if I need fewer speakers, if I don't need as much output, I can just take one of these and still have a great tone. I think modularity is one of the most important things, and it's one of the reasons I actually bought these cabinets. I do the same thing with my PA FR rig. I've got 2 1x15 speakers, and that means that I can take one along with me if I need to. It's got tons of power. It's a Yamaha DXR 15. I think it's got 1,000 watts output. I can take one of those, or if I really want to, I can take 2 and stack them on top of each other to have a really tall 2x15 rig that, you know, there's no chance of me not hearing it, but at the same time I can just take one cab along with me and have classic sounds from loads of classic amps. So I'd say modularity is one of the most important things. As well as from a health perspective, having, you know, 2 lighter weight cabinets is much better for your health than trying to lift one really big, say 4x10, that you're kind of bending over and trying to do this round. It's just not good for your body, it's not good for your health, it's not good for your back, it's not good for you long term. Bass is a heavy instrument. The speakers required to reproduce the sound of a heavy instrument, a deep bassy instrument, require more weight, and so I think wherever you can, avoid having massive one-handed lifts. Take 2 smaller cabs, 3 smaller cabs. I think that's the best thing about these modern speakers, this modern era of bass amplification, is you can choose. You can have 3, I can stack 3 of these if I wanted to with an Aguilar DB751, but you know, no part of that rig is more than 20 kilograms on its own, the head being the heaviest part of that. The other thing I say is that if you've got a combo, make sure it's got an extension out, so you can have your combo itself, that amp and cab in one box, and then you can also add a second speaker. For me, I don't think you'll ever need more than 2 speaker cabinets if you've got 2 12-inch speakers. Maybe you might want another one if you're driving 10-inch speakers, but broadly, once you're into around the mid-20s in terms of speaker inch, so my 212s is 24 inches of speaker, I've never really needed any more than that, particularly if I've got PA support. The final and most important thing is what's your tonal aim, and what is your aim with the rig. Do you want a versatile rig that can do everything? In which case, maybe you need to be looking at something like the FR rig, the Helix, where you've got a whole range of classic amplifiers and you can choose what you like. Do you want something more vintage, where maybe something like an Aguilar and Ampe is going to be your kind of tone? That top end isn't so cutting, so biting, isn't so brittle, and that's kind of characteristic of a more modern tone, whereas the Aguilar is going to have something more like a rounded B15 type tone, where the top end is there, but it's not quite so glassy. Maybe you want to have something like a Mark bass, which has got a very strong mid-range presence. Or maybe you want something more old school, like an SWR, where they had a very big scoopy mid-range, or the Ashdown stuff, where once you put that shape button in, you get that scooped Trace Elliot type sound. Tone is probably the most important thing when buying a bass amp, because the amp is going to really dictate overall the broad brush strokes of your tone. When it comes to sound, typically the last thing in the chain is the thing that's going to really dictate how your tone is reproduced. And the amplifier is the last thing in your tone in many instances. So you've got to make sure that the brush strokes, the colours that are being provided by that amp are what you really want to hear. If you've got an amp with an entirely the wrong colour, literally talking about colours, so you've got a blue amp but you want to hear a bit more red, then having a blue amp is probably a really bad idea. You want to have something that produces more of those red sounds that you're hearing. So that is it really. If you want to have a certain type of tone, you need to make sure that your amp and the choice of amp you're using, as well as the speaker cabinet combination and everything leading up to that, is what you want to hear. There's no point in just buying any amp and expecting it just to be an amp. They all have a colour, they all have an EQ shape, and you need to make sure that that matches up with what you want to hear in your head. So those are my tips for buying a bass amp. I think broadly you just need to spend a good amount of money on the speaker side of things, and whatever head you can afford and matches well with the sound in your head, that's the way to go. That's the truth about buying a bass amp nowadays. There are tons of choices. Keep it lightweight if you can in certain areas. Yes, people will say there's better tone to be able to be had from a bigger rig, but if you're out regularly, gigging, playing regularly, you're going to want something that's lighter weight and that you can just get to the gig. Ultimately, I've had rigs that I loved that were just way too heavy and sat at home, and I never took out. They never left the house because it was too much of an effort, too much of a hassle, and it took too long to get from the gig and setting up to back out and taking that rig out to the car, getting that car near because you've got such a heavy rig. It's just a pain. So that's my truth about buying a bass amp. You need to find the tone that you want in your head, then pair that with as modular a rig as you can, so you can have it at a small situation or a large situation, and make sure that those speakers are as good as they possibly can be to reproduce a proper tone that you'll want to hear and really enjoy. Don't forget to let me know in the comments below what you think of my 3 points for and against. Do you agree with them? Do you think that's the truth about buying a bass amp in this era? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe if you've enjoyed this video, and hit the notification bell as well. There's always more videos coming and more content like this. If it's helped you, hit that like button and let me know that this video has been helpful to you. Don't forget to go and follow me on my Instagram, that will be linked below. And thank you so much for watching this video, and I'll see you in the next one.